tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So as we've been exploring the beginning of the Mahāyāna, or the Great Vehicle, as described in the text, The Perfection of Wisdom in 8,000 lines, really sets out the framework of an approach to the Dharma that begins, I think, with these two aspects that we've been looking at. One is a meditation that is free of thought and very, very spacious. And I want to look a little bit more at that tonight, and like we did in the practice. And then the other is a deconstruction of language. And these are related, right? That the language that we use to talk about anything can be seen through as being ultimately not useful or not accurate in describing things, because language functions by limiting something. Descriptive language limits. It creates borders about what a thing is or what it isn't, and that ultimately this great vehicle is going to suggest that nothing can be pinned down in that way. And because of that, words can't be used in any kind of ultimately reliable sense to name or delimit experiences or beings. And so we get then, in a certain way, the beginnings of what will come to full flower in traditions like Zen that come to really love this kind of language and paradox. But you get language like, a bodhisattva is a bodhisattva when they understand that there's no such thing as a bodhisattva. How does a bodhisattva course in perfect wisdom? Well, because there's no such thing as a bodhisattva and no such thing as perfect wisdom and no such thing as coursing in, then to say that a bodhisattva courses in perfect wisdom is something that, I can't really say. You get that kind of language from the beginning of this text. At the same time, you get, again and again, references to a meditation that is both free of thought, but also not a concentration on silence or, an immersive concentration in the way that we're used to thinking about, meditations that lead to jhana, like the breath meditation or meditation on, different aspects of the body or experience. This is a meditation on a thought that is no thought. And the version of it that we did today is, in a certain way, almost directly from the text. And what it comes down to is a meditation where awareness is allowed to be quite unfixed, and where the concentration is a concentration on not grasping. And so one way you can interpret this, and the way that I was suggesting we practice tonight, is that we practice with a kind of open awareness. So you're sitting in meditation, you kind of get centered and grounded and just established. But then instead of letting awareness fixate on a stable perception in order to enter concentration, like focusing on the breath, or even on sounds, or the posture of the body, or some other object, you set, this is all kind of a somatic metaphor, but how it feels to me is that you kind of sit back from that a little bit, and you let awareness be present in consciousness. So you're not unconscious of what's happening. You know what awareness is tagging on, but you don't let it stick to or grasp at or fixate on anything. And so that means when my attention is drawn to a sound, I know it, but I don't follow it. I don't kind of get into where it's going, which could develop into like, what is that? Or what am I hearing? Or I like that, or I don't like that, or all the things that happen that turn into story. I resist that. I just let it be. So there's a knowing, I'm aware of that, but it doesn't have to become anything. And the place that this really gets going is when I become aware of thoughts. A thought arises. And, in some kinds of like vipassana practice, inquiry practice, I might follow the thought for a little bit and really understand what it is. Oh, it's planning. And underneath that is a kind of anxiety emotion. And that's unpleasant. There's dukkha. So I understand that the planning is a kind of grasping and that there's suffering in that. This is very basic, first and second noble truth kind of practice. So that's one way to work with thoughts, right? Investigate the thoughts, see the impermanence, see the dukkha. Very Theravada style vipassana. Then there's the samatha style, where you notice the mind wandering, and instead of doing that investigation, you just come right back to your stable object. He's like, not now. You come right back to the breath, and you learn to stabilize with one object. And the object is really your guide rope. It's you're holding on to it to get out of the maze of constricted thinking. You're Theseus holding onto the golden thread spun by your girlfriend Ariadne, who's really a spider goddess. And you have to hold on to this to get out of the labyrinth of the Minotaur, which is the mind. I'll say in this, Buddhist Greek mythos retelling, the concentration object is the thread, and you hold on to it. Don't lose it, right? So that's the breath. So in those two styles, you're either investigating the thought to understand it as having the characteristics, impermanent, suffering, selflessness, or you're setting it aside immediately and staying with your object. In this style, it's kind of a third style in a way. There's no concentration object. So you're neither investigating the thought, nor pushing it away, nor trying to hold on to anything else. But it's closer to the samatha style. It's closer to concentration than it is to insight, because it doesn't lean into anything. It rests way back. And what it's a concentration on is on the action or non-action. It's really a concentration on non-action, on the act of not grasping. And so the way the text says it is like this. Let me find it. Okay, so here's one way of putting this. I think I read this last week. All right, the one practicing in this way does not go near any dharma at all. Here, dharma means thing, concept, solidified experience, that kind of thing. But it really means like things that could have a name, right? So I don't go near the dharma called bodhisattva, right? Or the dharma called suffering, or the dharma called path, even. Or even the dharma of like, I practice. I'm practicing meditation. I'm not going to go anywhere near the dharmas of I or practice or meditation. And so doing that, right, they do not go near any dharma at all, because all dharmas are unapproachable and unappropriable. So you can't get near them even if you want to, and you can't grasp at them even if you want to, because they're not there to grasp at. The bodhisattva then has the concentrated insight, quote, not grasping at any dharma, unquote, by name. Not grasping at any dharma by name, vast, noble, unlimited, and steady, not shared by any of the disciples or pratyeka Buddhas. But when they dwell in this concentrated insight, a bodhisattva will quickly win the full enlightenment which the Tathagatas of the past have predicted for them. But when they dwell in that concentration, they do not review it, nor think, I am collected, I will enter into concentration, I am entering, I have entered. All that in each and every way does not exist for them. So the insight at heart, and it's a concentrated insight, so it's both a meditation and the result of the meditation, of course, because is not the practice is not grasping at any dharmas. So to not grasp at something is both not to fixate on its name, not to fixate on its story, but it's also, in meditation, not to even let the attention glom onto it in a way and get wrapped up in it. So if we take this to its, further implications, it's not just thoughts, of course, in which we grasp onto or appropriate dharmas, but in subtle layers of view, we do this all the time, right? And one of the most important, of course, here is the dharma called I, or myself, right? Or the dharma called them, or themselves, or the dharma called the path, or the dharma called the dharma, right? I practice the dharma. So the bodhisattva doesn't grasp at any of those dharmas. And so, okay, so we're, in a certain way, it gets to be like, okay, so you can't use any words at all to talk about that. And fine, But what I love is that just now when we were talking about, a few people brought into the discussion, like what that meditation felt like. Because I think it's important to ground this kind of practice in real life and in the body and in the moment. Even if, like, sure, we're going to say, like, yeah, there's no such dharma as real life or body or moment. That's fine. Now we're going to assume that every word we use to describe something is an ungraspable, unappropriable dharma. So let's just understand that that's the nature of this entire talk and everything we say about it. So we don't have to say that every sentence. The text kind of does, though. But, it's just trying to make a point. But if we get that, okay, what do we then do with this? And the first thing that comes out that I think is really interesting is that this kind of meditation, for some folks, is much easier than either concentration or vipassana, samatha or vipassana. That this is a doorway that some folks really can have access to, where you start with relaxing the body and the mind, and this can be a kind of there's actually a beautiful comment in the chat that speaks to this, right? It's challenging to hold the paradox of efforting enough to do nothing. That's exactly what this meditation is. It takes a bit of effort to do it, not because it takes effort to relax, but because it takes effort to resist the habit of not relaxing, the habit of the mind launching into something else. It's like if you notice restlessness in the body, it takes some effort not to squirm. And so, how do you, let's say you lay down to sleep at night, but you're still kind of buzzing from something, and the body's kind of twitchy, and you keep having the impulse to get up and do something, but you're really trying to just let yourself lay there and relax. What do you have to do in that moment? And what you have to do is resist impulse, right? There's all these little muscular impulses that come through. Get up and do something, Sometimes when I'm working, it gets really boring and I want to go and read the news or look at Facebook or something. And I can actually notice the impulse to open a certain browser window or close a certain window or move my hand in a certain way that will make images appear on the magical screen that will distract me from the spreadsheet I'm supposed to be looking at. I can actually notice the impulse both as a mental, I don't want to think about this, I'd rather think about something else, but also as a physical, I have an impulse to move my hand in a certain direction. And I can, if I have enough energy, and it takes energy to do this, I can resist that impulse. And what happens when I do it is that for a moment that takes a bit of effort. And then it passes. And one of the biggest humps to get over with any kind of discipline, but particularly when we're trying to confront addictive patterns, like addictive patterns of thought and view here, We have to figure out how to get over that initial hump of an impulse, and the impulse is contractive in a certain way, right? So I was doing the meditation with you, and I was resting in this kind of, awareness space and not grasping at anything. And for a little while, it was very, very silent, super spacious, really delicious. And then I got a tiny bit bored. And when I got a little bit bored, a thought crept in. And for a moment, a handful of moments, like, several sentences worth of moments in the mind. It wasn't all words, but several sentences or images. My mind flashed on a thing that I had read in the paper earlier today online, some subject. And I noticed it, a short ways into that. And what I noticed was that my energy had dipped, had kind of flagged for a moment. And the habit of taking up an entertaining thought had come in. And then I just did the practice of just not grasping at that. And not grasping at it, it disappeared and I settled back. And then I gave myself the instruction again, okay, relax more deeply. Because part of what we're doing is, the body and mind and heart are so conditioned toward these reflexive, reactivities in the world. I'm grabbing at thoughts, or I'm grabbing at stories as they pass by, and the effort that it takes to just let them go by is a certain kind of, it takes a certain kind of will. But it's a very interesting effort because what you're trying to do is not do. And so it's the effort to not follow a habitual impulse. Now, in a very funny way, I invented a game about this when I was a very young child. This is another one of my stories of weird, weird young child invents mystical Buddhist idea without knowing it kind of stories. And then I'll tell you about a really amazing teacher who has more amazing stories than me about that kind of thing. But I remember at one point being a kid, I was probably, maybe I was 7 or 8, something like that. I'm not sure. But I remember sitting in a little chair, and it was a little chair. It was kind of like, one of those chairs where the seat is about a foot off the ground. It was like a toddler chair almost. This tiny chair. I'm little. And I remember sitting in it and noticing that in order to stand up from the chair, I had to want to. And so I did this whole thing where I would sit down and stand up, sit down and stand up. And I would notice that I had to want to stand up. So then I sat down and it's like, okay, well, what if I don't want to get up? Okay, so I'm not getting up. That's fine, right? Makes sense. Then I was like, okay, what happens if I want to get up, but I don't? So I would sort of wait until I wanted to get up and then I would not get up. It's like, okay, I'm resisting a natural impulse. That's something. But then I would be like, okay, can I would notice that even when I want to get up, the action of getting up had to be initiated by something. This is child Sean discovering volition. So I discover that I have to send a signal called get up. There has to be a decision, not just a want, but a decision. I'm good. Get up now, right? And then I would get up. And then I would do this game with myself where I would try to send the directive to get up as sincerely as I could. Like I would try to really intend to get up and then resist it. And I did this thing where I would just sit there and I would be like, I'm going to get up now and not get up. I'm going to get up now and not get up. And I'd see, and it was clear quickly that, of course, pretending that I was intending to get up and actually having the volition were different. So I would try to really want it and really mean it and then not do it. Okay, so that was me inventing this practice at the age of 7. Maybe I'll take a moment here to mention somebody who was one of the most respected modern elders in Buddhist scholarship and an expert on emptiness, Professor Jeffrey Hopkins, who passed away yesterday. So blessings to the memory of the great and venerable Jeffrey Hopkins. Professor Hopkins was a Buddhologist. He studied Tibetan. He translated for the Dalai Lama. He spent his entire life teaching at, his entire professional life teaching at one university. He was drawn very early on to study Tibetan and to study theories of emptiness and to work out some particular philosophical problems in what's called the Prasangika Madhyamaka school. You can read his thesis that became a book called Meditations on Emptiness. Not the easiest reading, but there you go. A marvelous professor. But he said that he not only always had an affinity with the Tibetans, but he actually could remember past lives of being a Tibetan monk, and that when he was a child, he says, he talked to himself in a made-up language, and for a long time his inner dialogue was in a different language, and he figured it was just a childhood made-up language, and this went on so long that he had to figure out as a child how to translate into English in order to talk to adults. So he does this. He has an imaginary language. He eventually figures out how to talk to adults in English. And then he goes off to school and he realizes that his imaginary language was Tibetan. So make of that what you will. But some people, they're really connected. And that's mysterious, but there you go. So blessings to the memory of a great bodhisattva. So we have this meditation on awareness, where the focus of the meditation and the insight that comes from it is the non-grasping of all dharmas, or the non-appropriation of all dharmas. And this is linked to an active practice of, and we might even say the embodiment of, the recognition that language is empty, that all of the language used to indicate things is empty of intrinsic essence. And the text begins to use language like does not exist, beings do not exist. It's important to both wrestle with the implications of this, but also understand that translation is imperfect here. And what does not exist means in Sanskrit is, or what it's a translation of from Sanskrit is does not have swabhava, inherent existence. Swa means inherent in itself, and bhava means like existence or being or becoming. So I mentioned this a few weeks ago. This is an imperfect parallel to what originally Kant and later Heidegger would call the thing in itself. So does a thing, like a person or an object, have an intrinsic, meaning contained in itself, stable, eternal essence? Is there such a thing as, this person in a way that transcends time and space and doesn't change? Because that's what an essence would be. If there's an essence to a thing, it has to be what it is forever. And this will get taken apart by the Mahāyāna philosophers in a very deep way. And Nagarjuna, which we touched on a few weeks ago, we'll go back to at some point, really understands how this falls apart. Because, and one of the core ways we can understand this is really pointing toward interconnection, right? One of the core ways we can understand this is that if any of us, we'll do it in relation to beings because that's kind of the most important thing here, but it's true for everything. If any of us had a swabhava, an intrinsic stable individual essence. That essence that somehow defines us would have to be stable through all time and space. And so in that sense, you could call it like your eternal soul in some way, something that defines you. But if that thing were permanent and unchanging, it would have to, by its nature, not traverse the path. So that essence of you, it can't be an essence that in this moment is suffering, and then in these moments is practicing the path, and in this moment realizes freedom. So the equation that the Buddha lays out, right, that beings suffer because of ignorance, etc., grasping, then they practice the Eightfold Path, and then they realize arahantship, they enter the stream, they realize they uproot the defilements, and they're free forever. They become liberated. That whole storyline doesn't mix with a storyline of us having an intrinsic, eternal, unchanging essence. Because if that essence is unchanging, was it suffering and now it's free? That's a big change. So then you get like, okay, this is the Vedanta story. Okay, it's an unchanging essence, and suffering was just an illusion. It only seemed like you were suffering, but actually the essence is liberated all along. That's one solution to that problem. But if suffering is completely an illusion, right, then is liberation also an illusion? Well, it must be, right? Because if you weren't ever really suffering, then you can't really get liberated. You were just restoring the natural state. This is going to eventually lead in the tantric systems to a variety of beautiful explanations for existence, including like one from the Kashmir tradition, the Shaiva tradition. There's a beautiful text called the Pratyabhijna Hridayam, 20 verses on the heart of perfection, and in this vision of reality, everything is intrinsically, fundamentally free and has agency, and everything is fundamentally the goddess. And it says the goddess, which is everything, creates all things on the canvas of her own body out of play. So everything is illusory and real at the same time. It's all the body of the goddess, and the action of seeing and then being an illusion, like seeing clearly and then not seeing clearly, is just pure awareness, which is Shiva, opening his eye and closing his eye. And so there's a divine action of revealing and a divine action of concealing, among others. And so you can see how this is a reasonable, you might say, and devotionally tinged solution to the problem of how an eternal intrinsic essence could exist for beings, and still there could be the experience that we have of being confused or not confused, of being bound or liberated. In the Mahāyāna, the solution to the problem is emptiness, that there's no svabhava at all, that the idea of an eternal intrinsic essence is also a dharma that is empty, right? And the way that this is partly because it's a non-theistic tradition. The Hindu traditions, from Vedanta all the way through Advaita Vedanta, the non-dual traditions and the tantric traditions, they start off with the idea that there's an eternal soul, but that eternal soul is not separate from God. And that becomes a solution to the same problem, right? The Buddha says emptiness, the Hindus say fullness. But they amount essentially to exactly the same thing. And there's a beautiful study of non-duality by David Loy that looks at these, that looks at a few different non-dual models, including the emptiness model from the Mahāyāna and the fullness model from Advaita Vedanta, and proposes that the meditative experience that we're talking about is the same for both. And you can see how this would be the case, right? That if you're deeply resting in awareness, everything is just unfolding around you, and you're practicing the dharma of not grasping at any dharmas. You're practicing that concentration. You can stabilize that very deeply, enter a deeply non-grasping, relaxed state. Very, very, and where then essentially the thing you're concentrating on is awareness itself. This is going to become Dzogchen eventually, and Mahamudra and Advaita kinds of meditations, Shikantaza kinds of meditations. So you're doing this kind of very, very spacious meditation where you're not picking up anything. You're not doing anything, And you might notice how, okay, you're Buddhist, you've come from these kinds of Dharma talks, and you're like, oh, everything is empty. Everything is empty of self-nature. But if you were, your friend who practices, in a Shaiva tradition, they might say, oh yeah, pure awareness is Shiva. That's the god Shiva, and that's the nature. Or you meet up with a friend who's a Dzogchen practitioner and say, yo, that's the nature of mind. And those traditions tend to solidify awareness into a thing. Oh, there is this thing, pure awareness, or awareness is the substance of the universe, right? In the Pratibhijna Hridayam, awareness is the body of the goddess, right? Or awareness is part of the play of Shiva and Shakti, of awareness and phenomenal arising. All of these are different ways of explaining this experience that we can have where we strip away all of the things that the mind gets caught on, and there's just the sense of being aware or awake to them. And then you can call that awareness a thing, or you can call it a deity, or the true nature of things, or you can do what the perfection of wisdom does here and see that it also is empty. And so this is more my tradition is to lean in that direction. We'll leave the tantric Shiva Shakti dance to the tantric folks. But it makes sense to me that these things are actually very, very close siblings, and I have a warm feeling for those traditions as well. I've spent some time there. So the non-appropriation of all dharmas, the non-grasping at anything, the resting in a profound awareness, and that awareness undercuts language at every step. The text then says, okay, so a bodhisattva is one who is not afraid when encountering this dharma. So I want to hang out there for a minute, because what it points to is that the natural response to being told that everything you think you are is an illusion, essentially, is fear, right? It's destabilizing to the ego, to the nervous system, to the sense of self. And, and appropriately so. So, to feel into the psychology of it a bit, right? When there's been wounding, which there has for virtually everyone, and when there's just the natural developmental process, which there is for virtually everyone, the way the developmental process plays out and the way wounding plays out is that there's a sense of being someone, right, that we create, and it's appropriate and it's natural to do so, and you have a name and you have who you are and you have your conditions, and we have all of the identities that define us as who we are, some of which we inherit, some of which we grow as we develop, some of which we seek out and develop, and all of those, and particularly the felt sense of being someone. I think the reason why this svabhava is so like, yeah, that's me, I have an essence, it feels like me, is that the sense of self is it's not just a deeply seductive illusion, it's also a deeply important, fundamental social and relationally organizing principle. It's a psychologically organizing principle. You have to know who you are. And so the proposal here is not that who you are is unimportant, or somehow it's wrong to engage with who we are or who each other is in a way where there's like, oh yeah, there's relationships are important, individual psychology is important, family psychology is important, social identities are important. I think what is proposed here is that there's a meditation and a kind of insight where we see that all of those things we think of as important are relatively important, but not ultimately defining. And the bodhisattva is the one who's not afraid of that, right? Can you be not afraid of setting aside your life story for a moment and resting in the absence of it? Can you be not afraid to set down your social location or your social identity or your various positionalities in meditation in order to understand that all of those things are empty of being able to fundamentally define you, right? And I think this is so embedded in the teachings on rebirth, because so many of the things that constitute our felt sense of an identity are true to the extent that they define this lifetime, right? Like I have a certain racial identity that I can't imagine being otherwise. I'm mixed race in this particular way, England, Spain, Puerto Rico, yada yada stuff. I have a history that's colored by that, and in contemporary social politics, that's a meaningful, even like life-defining set of conditions, right? Our racial identity is so profoundly defining right now of how other people treat us, how we treat us, how we move through the world, what's available to us, what's not, all these different things. Racial identity is supercharged right now, right? And so to say that it's empty might seem like that's an invitation to deny or reject or marginalize the very real impacts of racial consciousness in this moment, right? Oh, race is totally not empty. Race is really full with meaning right now. That's true. But it's only true for us as individuals to the extent that we identify with this one lifetime and this one moment in history. But if we take on the suggestion that we've been born innumerable times in innumerable kinds of bodies, and maybe particularly even, so that alone could blow race out of the water in terms of it being an individual identity. At the most, it's a temporary identity, given that this is only my temporary body. But we could go further with that. We could say, oh, if rebirth, then not only have I been lots of different kinds of bodies, but even if we say in a very ordinary way, like, okay, fine, ancestry, I'm part of a long family lineage, a bloodline that comes from these various places. The concept of whiteness is only a couple hundred years old. At most, it stems in English and related European language cultures. The idea of whiteness goes back only as far as the initial colonial encounters with non-whiteness. But as far as we can tell, scholars now, whiteness is more or less invented in the American South as a political strategy to divide poor settlers from Scottish and Irish and Eastern European stock from poor free black folks from African stock, who were allied on class grounds and who had to be divided in order to preserve power. by the wealthy. That's one story. Empty, but also true. So we can see race as empty, but we can also see it as modern. Like race is a modern thing. And there's other aspects that are much older, right? The Buddha was around and speaks at length about the beginnings of what would come to be the caste system in India. And it was already true there that Brahmins were lighter skinned and Shudras, or folks lower down the caste ladder, were darker skinned. And evidence of racial preference and identity go all the way back there. It's probable that the god Krishna was a very dark-skinned person. The word Krishna means black, means the color black. And so, but because dark-skinned beings were not, considered as holy as the lighter-skinned Brahmins, Krishna gets depicted as blue in some of the images. So there's, we could tell lots of stories about race and how it shows up in different cultures, but the insight from the perfection of wisdom here is that it's empty. All of those don't denote race as an eternal unfixed, or an eternal fixed, stable social quality. It's a fluid, dynamic, interwoven, culturally contextual identity marker that's different everywhere at every different moment. And, in a very postmodern way, there's an understanding now that it's different for every body, every racialized body, even within broad categories of commonality. A black body in Oakland, California has a different experience of blackness than a black body in Macon, Georgia, or a black body in Houston, or a black body in Boston, or a black body in Quebec. It was really interesting to my wife and I when we went to France and Spain on our honeymoon, partly to do long silent retreats, which is a great thing to do on your honeymoon, but also to wander around France and Spain. And one of the things we noticed in France was that the black folks there that we encountered felt very, very different from the black folks that we knew here in California and in the States. And we had all these conversations about the difference between the slavery history that's the deep back history of blackness here in North America, and the colonial relationship between France and like Senegal and other French-speaking African colonies, and Africans coming to live in France, how different those histories were, and how we could feel them manifesting differently in these different people. And France just went through an election where race was very central, and the anti-immigrant kind of fascist adjacent party almost did really well, but they didn't, fortunately, that's my opinion, didn't do as well as they had hoped and as many folks thought they would. But race in France is really different than race in the States. A different history, different context. So the Buddha here points to the emptiness of dharmas in a way that, in a postmodern way, we can really understand. Things are radically contextual, different for every body, and actually, in a way, microscopically, radically different for, individual bodies, even at different moments in our life, right? Your perception of who you are racially is different now than it was 20 years ago, partly because the conversation about what race means is different now than it was 20 years ago. And we've all been awakened into different kinds of racialized consciousness because we're immersed in the cultures we're in, and we're learning and we're changing, and the language is changing around us, right? And some of these highly charged social markers are actually some of the best places to explore this doctrine of radical emptiness, because you can see them changing, as we speak, right? Just already in our lifetime, right? There are folks who now are BIPOC, but 10 years ago were POC, who 10 years before that were Black, who 40 years before that were colored, you know? And like all of these words, right, these dharmas are empty, but they carry force. And I think part of why bodhisattvas are not afraid of the doctrine of emptiness is that they've learned somehow to hold the changing kinds of force that language carries, and in a way where they live in the world, like they understand how things work, and they understand emptiness enough to be not afraid of losing the fixated social identities and psychological identities that they, previously have been defined by. Right? When you understand, when you course in emptiness like a bodhisattva, as this text would say, you're not like a member of your family in the same way. Like what's frightening? It's frightening to think that my bond with my family is kind of just a temporary, a temporary flowering of interwoven conditions, and it's going to dissolve. Like I'm not a race because I'm not actually this body. I'm not a gender or a sexuality or a social class, because all of that is so temporary, and radically contextual. We could tell stories endlessly about any of these charged definitions, like, oh, there's just a feeling of being myself. I just have a feeling of being a self. And see if you can connect with that, and how that feels like it's been consistent for your whole life, or if it has. And maybe you connect with the places where you feel like that's really changed. I just feel like a different person than I was before. Bodhisattvas aren't afraid of losing that sense of self. And bodhisattvas aren't afraid of losing their caste, losing their identity. And in fact, they're not afraid of losing anything that felt like a certainty in the mind around how things are. Right? The way, even the way that, like, I think I understand something because I know I have a really good story about it. Even some of these historical or social stories that I'm telling tonight as examples, I might get a certain satisfaction or a feeling of groundedness by knowing some history. Oh, I can tell a story about race, or a story about class, or a story about gender that, that brings in some fair amount of good story, right? And by good, I just mean maybe is helpful to myself or others. The bodhisattva is not afraid of that entire story being seen through as empty. And so what we want to connect with then, if we want to get a felt sense of what this path is pointing toward, we would connect with how deeply we can get comfortable with this radically exploded vision, and where are the places where we kind of flinch, where I'm like, yeah, but and the social ones are really, some of the places where we can trip the most, and they don't have to be identity categories, like the ones I was just talking about, but they could also be big concepts. And so you could take a concept like justice, but you could also take a concept like love, to take a deep one, right? Think about how you feel like love is a kind of, what is love, right? I don't want to say that in a like, what is love? Like a kind of blithe, take the concept of love, or the felt sense of love, and how it can feel like almost like a divine force in the universe. It might even feel like the substance of the universe. and notice how deep our stories are about it, how much it means to us, and that we might have a felt sense of what this thing love is. And then, the bodhisattva is the one who is unafraid to see that that too is an ungraspable dharma. Right? You can't revert to any comfortable story about things, including, of course, the story of the perfection of wisdom. Right? You can't be like, oh yeah, that's it. I'm taking my stand on the perfection of wisdom and everything is empty of all certainty. It's like, nope, you didn't get it yet, because you can't take it. Bodhisattvas don't take a stand anywhere. Nothing. It's just, it undercuts every concept that you might find as a ground. And so landing in an extraordinary groundlessness that isn't the same as the groundlessness of like postmodern free fall, anxiety, depression, freak out. It's the groundlessness of like, even all of that is dharmas to grasp at. Right? Even the idea of healing is a dharma to grasp at. But the idea of unwellness is also a dharma that gets grasped at. I'm not well and I need to be healed. I'm doing my work of healing. I'm doing my work at all. Right? All of these are ungraspable dharmas. So let me just read I'll find a good line in it to sum us up for the night, so that I can let the text say the last word here, and then we'll take a moment for some conversation. All right, so just one last word on the meaning of the great vehicle then. So Subhuti asks the Buddha a question about the great vehicle, the Mahāyāna. A bodhisattva is a great being armed with the great armor who sets out in the great vehicle. What is that great vehicle? And so the Buddha says, great vehicle, that is a synonym of immeasurableness. Immeasurable means infinite. By means of the perfections has a bodhisattva set out in it. It has set out to where there is no objective support. It will be a bodhisattva, a great being who will go forth, but they will not go forth to anywhere, nor has anyone set out in it. It will not stand anywhere, but it will stand on all knowledge by way of taking its stand nowhere. By means of this great vehicle, no one goes forth, has gone forth, or will go forth, because neither of these dharmas, the one who goes forth and that by which they go forth, exist, nor can they be got at. Since all dharmas do not exist, what dharma could go forth by what dharma? It is thus that a bodhisattva, a great being, is armed with the great armor and has mounted on the great vehicle. And the great vehicle is this Mahāyāna. It transports all beings to liberation. But that's what it is. It's a great vehicle that is not mounted upon by any being. It's as empty as everything else. So, all right. With a concept like that swirling around, there's nowhere to stop. So I'll just stop there for now, and so inviting any responses or questions or inquiry as we go, as you go forward into the week. But the inquiry is something like, what is it to be unafraid of this kind of radical approach, and what are we afraid of? And really, like, how does it feel to take a moment to see through, even to be willing to see through this extraordinary stack of dharmas by which we've construct the sense of ourself and each other.